academic year 2020-2021. This is the 7th year that we've been hosting the workshop, but it is the very first time that we are doing it virtually. Of course, the dynamics will be different. We do not have the luxury of sharing the same physical space or experiencing that warmth that comes with face-to-face interaction. And I know that students looked forward to a day away from your schools when you could also visit a university that many of you hope to soon attend. So yes, this year's workshop is different. This new online presentation is definitely different. But if you really consider it, these normal circumstances that we are accustomed to are peripheral to the objectives of the workshop, which are to provide assistance to students studying for the examinations. This year's workshop represents our new normal, and maybe the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed us into a direction that was inevitable, and dare I say, possibly even more practical and efficient. In keeping with the restrictions mandated by the COVID-19 pandemic, our presentations have been pre-recorded and have been posted on the History Department's YouTube channel. There are half-hour sessions on topics selected from your syllabus. You can post your questions in the link provided, and you can rest assured that your questions will be answered. When we really consider this new scenario, it does provide you with one huge advantage. You can revisit the presentations as many times as you wish. We in the Department of History continue to be very aware of our role as keepers and disseminators of knowledge of the past. And as we have done before, we are and will continue to take all the necessary measures to ensure that we fulfill this responsibility of keeping the discipline of history alive and applicable to the present and the future. Additionally, our penultimate goal is the molding of young and not so young minds towards the creation and fostering of informed, well-grounded, and well-rounded adults who can make positive and valid contributions to the development of self, nation, and region. Pandemic or whatever other hurdles may come our way, we will not be deterred from achieving both these goals. I must remind you that history is way more than just about writing and passing exams. It provides you with the tools with which and the foundation on which empires have been built. Let us be the architects of our society, taking it into the future on the back of its history. Also, you are now part of our country's history, where for the very first time, we are experiencing a pandemic in such pervasive and almost debilitating manner. You are also part of the UWI's history, since for the very first time, teaching and learning are being done virtually. As has been done throughout our region's history, students must rise to the current challenge and let it not debilitate you or deter you from excelling in your studies. Our online presentations are geared towards assisting you to achieve this excellence. So students, engage our new virtual forum. Visit the presentations as many times as you wish. Post whatever questions you may have. Appreciate the richness and relevance of our history and be inspired to further your study of history in your tertiary level studies, hopefully at the UWI. On that note, let me once again welcome you to our virtual CAPE workshop. This session will be done by Dr. Ronald Noel. Dr. Ronald Noel is the holder of a Ph.D. in history from Howard University. He has been with the UWI Department of History for many years. Dr. Noel's areas of historical expertise include secret societies, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Pan-Africanism.
Students of CAPE History Syllabus. My name is Dr. Ronald Noel. I'm from the Department of History at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. I'm happy to be with you today to share some information that would be of great use to you in your studies at the Cape level. And I hope at the end of it all, you're able to return to your schools and have further discussions and do further activities with your teachers. As mentioned earlier, students, today we are going to discuss a rather important topic of West Indian or Caribbean interests in terms of your historical studies at the Cape level. And it is called American Imperialism and the Panama Canal. Therefore, the presentation seeks to explain, or in this case, discuss American imperialism and the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is a major international shipping facility that is located in the Isthmus of Panama in Central America. At the end of this presentation, you will be able to, one, understand the idea of imperialism and American imperialism. Two, locate the Panama Canal in Central America. Three, address the extent to which American imperialism facilitated the building of the Panama Canal. And four, discuss the Caribbean people's experiences in the building of the canal. Britannica informs us that imperialism is the state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition, or by gaining political and economic control of other territories and peoples. Others, such as Jennifer Mohammed, states that it is, and we quote her, the conquest and control of another territory for political power and prestige. For example, the conquest of the Americas by Spain. Imperialism is also associated with the concept of empire. Dictionary.com states that it is, and we quote, is a group of nations or peoples ruled over by an emperor, empress, or other powerful sovereign or government, usually a territory of greater extent than a kingdom, as the former British Empire, French Empire, Russian Empire, Byzantine Empire, or Roman Empire. So, imperialism and empire are two associated terms, imperialism and empire. Brinkley informs us that in the 16th and 17th century, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and Great Britain all had empires in the Americas. You know that the Americas consist of North America, Central America, South America, and at times the Caribbean area. However, by the mid and late 19th century, the idea of empire assumed a different form relative to those of an earlier age. And with this, the term imperialism began to be used to describe this phenomenon. Quite frequently, Europeans started to create colonies, not particularly by sending vast numbers of migrants to settle and populate new territories, but by way of developing, and we quote, military, political, and business structures that allow them to dominate and profit from existing populations, as Brinkley says. The new imperialism altered the character of the interloping nations while amassing vast amounts of wealth, creating new classes of people whose existence was shaped by the forces of imperial business and administration. Colonial societies became eclipsed and connected to the extent of global industrial capitalism. That is to say, the capitalism that was associated with the Industrial Revolution and faced the introduction of European customs, institutions, and technologies within their spaces. Therefore, they had a number of, let's say, add ons, a number of riders, a number of incursions into their spaces as a result of the coming of interloping forces with imperialist ideas. As the notion of empire became more rampant in the West during the 19th century, there was a desire to justify them. Advocates of imperialism believed that the acquisition of colonies was critical to the health and survival of their own industrial nations. Colonies were regarded as a source of raw materials that were critical to industrial output. In addition, they were markets for the output produced and a source of labor. Some viewed colonization as a chance to export Christianity to pagan peoples, and new missionary groups appeared in Europe and America. Verdell Guppy, a researcher in biblical studies, suggested that the church escaped to America. The church escaped to America. And that is something you should discuss with your teachers. Some secular opinion argued that imperialism facilitated the entry of colonized peoples into the modern world. That statement is inherently racist. What happened to the civilizations of the people who existed before for hundreds of years, if not millennia? They had their modernity. Rudyard Kipling, a British poet and strong advocate for empire, showed in his poem entitled The White Man's Burden. So if you place the white man to the top of an isosceles triangle, he seemed to be in charge, and it is his responsibility for all those below who are not, in fact, as superior as he is. The white man's burden. That is, that it was the responsibility of the colonizers, in his view, to raise the less privileged to, and we quote, fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease, end quote. The development of empire was not only facilitated by need and desire, it also grew because of the new abilities of the imperial powers. These abilities took form in the invention of the telegraph, steamships, refrigerated ships, railroads, medicines, and the construction of canals, for example, the Suez Canal in 1869 and the Panama Canal in 1914. But that is not all. There was also the coming of the new military technologies, such as repeating rifles, machine guns, and modern artillery. These assets were consolidated to reach, conquer, and control distant lands. Reach, conquer, and control distant lands, says Brinkley. Perhaps the greatest imperial power known in the 19th century was Britain. Although it lost its 13 colonies, who became the United States of America, who we call loosely in this presentation America or American, in the 18th century, it still had possessions in North America, the Caribbean, India, Africa, Australia, and so on. As other imperialists, such as France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Japan, Italy, and the Dutch created a frenzy to obtain possessions in the 19th century, the Americans emerged as a player in this race. In this artist's depiction, we see an American male symbolizing imperialism. Pay close attention to the sword and the American flag covering in a paternalistic way a weaker, a weaker individual, in this case, someone from Cuba, protecting such a person from marauders, invaders, in this case, the Spanish. This will symbolize a significant relationship between America and Cuba in the future. American imperialism. In 1898, America came into the imperial race. This was due to America entering the conflict between Cuba and Spain. America replaced Cuba in 1898 as the colonizing and imperial power, and the conflict became known as the Spanish-American War. Homegrown advocates of empire, such as President Theodore Roosevelt, who served from 1901 to 1909, and their British counterparts held the conviction that a nation in the modern world without colonies would find it hard to remain or become a real great power. Roosevelt liked the idea of using American power in the world and articulated his beliefs through the proverb, and we quote him, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick," end quote. He also believed that civilized nations were white and uncivilized ones, for example, Latin nations, were not. See the racism. Hear the racism. Such nations were suppliers of raw materials, and they were also markets. Civilized nations were supposed to intervene in the affairs of the uncivilized ones for the betterment of both. After the war, America acquired Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, to name a few. It granted Cuba its independence in 1902, with a Platt Amendment attached to its constitution, which made it a protectorate. The Platt Amendment gave America the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and much more. A series of puppet governments governed the country as collaborators protecting American interests as they placed their infrastructure in the island. Therefore, America intervened in Cuban affairs in 1906, 1917, and 1920. The Platt Amendment was only repealed in 1934. So therefore, for all this time, the Cubans did not get the independence that they deserved. And it was through some good neighbor policy, that we see this amendment being repealed in 1934. Students, discuss this with your teachers and explore more of it to understand what it means to be a protectorate. Roosevelt was rather concerned about Latin America. He was unwilling to share trading rights and military control with another country. You must understand that imperialists would prefer to have it all for themselves, and they fiercely protect what is theirs for as long as they can and exploit what is theirs for as long as they can. This disposition goes back to the Monroe Doctrine in terms of what Roosevelt was thinking. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823. President James Monroe stated in 1823 that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by European powers, and that the political system of European powers was different from that of the United States, which would consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. So the Americans, beginning in 1823, began claiming the right to protect and possess the Western Hemisphere. Note at that time, they did not have the military might to do so, but as their industrial revolutions brought capabilities and they then began to become more technologically advanced in their military capacities, much later, then they could actually demonstrate such power. But the statement in 1823 was sufficient because it meant that the region was now mentally owned by America. Roosevelt went on to establish a number of ventures in the Caribbean and South America, and in the course of this set the stage for a number of interventions in the area that would continue well beyond his presidency. Important to his way of thinking was an incident that occurred in 1902. The government in Venezuela, South America, had failed to meet its financial obligations with European bankers. As a result, the naval forces of Britain, Italy, and Germany blockaded the country's coastline. The Germans bombed a Venezuelan port, and there were rumors that they had planned to set up a permanent base in the area. The opportunity came in this incident for Roosevelt to use the threat of American naval might to persuade the German Navy to move away. He also realized as a result of this that if Latin American countries defaulted on their debts, there would be the threat of European intrusions. In brief, this reality led Roosevelt to advance in 1904 the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is an evolution of American will. This is an evolution of the thoughts of America with regards to this grand real estate called the Western Hemisphere. Brinkley states that, and we quote him, the United States, he claimed, had the right not only to oppose European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, but also to intervene itself in the domestic affairs of its neighbors if those neighbors proved unable to maintain order and national sovereignty on their own. This was a bold and aggressive foreign policy. And it reflects on a classic imperialist theory, which suggests that if a particular occupier of a possession is unable to defend it effectively, then that occupier isn't deserving of owning that territory and should be removed from it or the territory taken from it. So this, in a sense, tells us something about the theory of effective occupation. The first opportunity to use the Roosevelt corollary came in 1903 after a corrupt and bankrupt government in the Dominican Republic was overthrown. But the new administration that replaced the former government was no better at liquidating the nation's $22 million in debt, which was owed to European nations. In passing, we observe an American flag on a building in the Dominican Republic, stating in this sense that it had assumed a level of sovereignty over this land. Think of the Roosevelt corollary. Applying the provisions of the Roosevelt corollary, an American receivership was established, which gave the imperialist country the right to take control of the Dominican customs. The Americans gave 45% of the revenues to the Dominicans and distributed the remainder to the European creditors. This system remained in force in one version or the other for over 30 years. Students, explore with your teachers the idea of an American receivership on the customs of another country. As we move into our discussion on Panama, it is important for you to understand where Panama is as well as where the canal is. The insert shows you that Panama is an isthmus separating two bodies of waters, and it's a narrow strip of land separating these bodies of waters. And it is connecting South America with Central America. To the north of Panama, the immediate bodies of water would be the Caribbean Sea. To the south would be the Pacific Ocean. Once Panama as a place ends, the next connecting it is Costa Rica. The larger map shows that the Panama Canal from the Caribbean Sea moves due south, due south, due south, and then shifts to southeast as it enters into the Bay of Panama. Into the Bay of Panama. Perhaps the most important accomplishment of President Theodore Roosevelt's term in office. Perhaps the most important accomplishment of President Roosevelt's term in office, which you know is 1901 to 1909, was the construction of the Panama Canal, which connected the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans by way of creating a channel through Central America. Initially, the idea was considered through Nicaragua at sea level, a project that would not require locks. However, attention was directed towards the narrow isthmus of Panama in Colombia. This was the site of a previously unsuccessful attempt by a French company. While the Panama course was not at sea level, the distance was shorter than through Nicaragua, and it was roughly 40% completed. President Roosevelt sent John Hay, his Secretary of State, to come to an agreement with the Colombian diplomats in Washington in order to commence the project without much delay. The American officials exerted a lot of pressure on their Colombian charge d'affaires colleague, whose name was Thomas Eran. This Colombian official unwisely signed an agreement which granted the Americans perpetual rights to a 6-mile wide canal zone in Colombia. For agreeing to this, the Americans would have paid Colombia $10 million plus an annual rental of $250,000. This treaty created outrage in the Colombian Senate, and it refused to approve it. In reaction to the treaty, Colombia dispatched another representative to Washington with specific instructions to demand no less than $20 million from the Americans, in addition to a proportion of the payment that was made to the French. President Roosevelt became angry at this development and started to investigate ways to bypass the Colombian government. He also found a ready ally in Philippe Bonnevalia, the chief engineer of the French Canal project. It is instructive to note, and we quote, in November 1903, he helped organize and finance a revolution in Panama with the support of the United States. Roosevelt landed troops from the USS Nashville in Panama to maintain order. Brinkley says, of significance to note here is that their presence prevented Colombian forces from suppressing the rebellion, and 3 days later, President Roosevelt recognized Panama as an independent state. Think about the theory of effective occupation and think of the Roosevelt corollary. Discuss this amongst your peers. Discuss this amongst your peers. As a natural course of action, the new Panamanian government wasted little time agreeing to the conditions that were rejected by the Colombian Senate. The rest is history. The canal's construction continued, and it was completed in 1914. The building of the Panama Canal finally provided that long-desired need to connect the international waters and strengthen the commerce of the world, something the Americans intended to protect and monopolize. Madaris and Sorel noted, and we quote them, the Panamanian Passageway accelerated the growth of US power in Central America. It also magnificently symbolized that power. However, there was political intrigue in the negotiations to build the canal. This led to an American-backed insurrection, which resulted in Panama seceding from Colombia. Racism was very evident in the construction of the canal as well. During the construction of the canal, 60,000 Barbadians and 85,000 Jamaicans went to work in the canal zone, in addition to several thousands more from Caribbean territories. Observe the racial dispositions in this picture. These are West Indian workers who are planting or placing dynamite into holes in order to demolish a side of block while building the canal. This was an extremely dangerous exercise. Here, again, look at the racial disposition. Others are working, chopping away at blocks to ensure the passageway for the canal. The wages that were paid were not provided on the basis of competence and skill, but on the basis of color. Thus, non-white people, and especially those who came from the Caribbean, were paid on the basis of silver. These workers became known as the silvermen or silver standard. Their white counterparts were paid on the basis of gold. They were known as gold men. So they were paid, on the basis of gold. The facilities provided for the workers also differed in terms of standards. Naturally, the workers from the Caribbean were allocated the lower standards of accommodation. Poor eating facilities, poor medical facilities. As a matter of fact, it led to rather desperate conditions. The irony of all of this was that the risk of being in Panama was equal to all workers. Before 1920, conservatively speaking, 15,000 British West Indians died while working in the canal. People were killed by the thousands from snakes, parasites, flus, hard work, and accidents. The trains killed many people, but that didn't stop the racial discrimination in pay and the prejudice that non-whites experience. All aspects of imperialism. When the canal was completed in 1914, many of the black workers from the Caribbean went back on to work in, let's say, railroad construction in Costa Rica and banana plantations in Honduras, in Central America. For example, for American-backed racist interests who continue to pay them exploitative wages. These countries in time would be called banana republics, a rather unfortunate racially charged economic profile, an epithet. Students, discuss the idea of banana republics with your teachers. Reading into seniors' work, one can tell that Panama money flowed into the Caribbean and it maintained the existence of many, many families across the region. But it came at a price not only in sickness and death, but also as unwitting collaborators of an American brand of imperialism. Yes, it is true that with the remittances, people were able to maintain their families back home. Women in particular took charge. They ran businesses, they constructed homes on behalf of their husbands. There was also the Panama look: hat, suit, and a shoe, which gave a sense that the person was prosperous. But it came at a price. They were unwitting collaborations, unwitting collaborators of an American brand of imperialism. As we pass, you see the grandeur of the construction of this canal, with the locks, the train lines. And when it opened, the SS Ancon sailed through it. This is a picture of that ship sailing through it. This is what the canal looked in modern times. Look at the massive container ships that it can in fact facilitate. It looks very prosperous, but the picture does not tell you anything about the pain and all the distress the construction of this canal in the context of imperialism. We recognize the majesty of it, but we must also commemorate what it meant to have this canal. The Panama Canal remained under American control from 1914 to 1979. Thereafter, control was transferred to the Panama Canal Commission, which was a joint venture between the United States and the Republic of Panama. Complete control of the Panama Canal was passed over to Panama, that is the Panama Canal Authority, at noon on December 31st, 1999. As we conclude, America was an excellent student of imperialism when it entered the field. It protected the Western Hemisphere with an aggressive foreign policy consisting of the Monroe Doctrine, the threat of naval and military power, intervention, revolution, technology, trade, commerce, racism, and political instruments such as the Platt Amendment and the Roosevelt Corollary, which informed its foreign policy. All of these elements played a role in some way in the construction and control of the Panama Canal. Imperialism is the term that is used to describe the project to take Panama and build a canal. To take Panama and build a canal. The racial discrimination that the Caribbean workers experienced was part of the civilized and uncivilized standards America used to relate to this non-white labor force. Thousands perished in the course of earning a living, and many more were able to remit funds home to support families. However, the cost of being made to appear inferior was too severe. This was and is the face of imperialism.